All right, so this talk is on troubleshooting polysomnographic issues. And if you've spent any length of time in the sleep lab at Hudson Valley, you're probably really honing your skills at troubleshooting because our equipment is just so sensitive and so prone to having issues that you really have to become the superstar at troubleshooting and trying to figure out why something's not working. It's just part of the job, and it has nothing to do with the quality of the equipment at Hudson Valley because it doesn't matter where you go. Any sleep labs, they're all going to have technical issues. So we need to be able to identify those issues and correct them. So, to kind of start an introduction on some of the troubleshooting issues that you might come across, the first thing we'll talk about is what an artifact is. So, an artifact is any extraneous or external signal that represents activity other than what we want to record for any given channel. What that means is, for example, when you look at your brainwave channels, if you see anything else besides brainwave activity in those channels, that's considered artifact. Goes with all the other channels. So anything that can cause noise or artifact within the channel can really obscure and make it difficult to be able to read what we need to be able to read. Because you've got to think that we are trying to read these very um, minute electrical potentials in comparison to all the other electrical activity going on in the room around the patient and the electrical field just coming from the outlet. So there's a lot of instrumentation and extras going on to really make sure that we're seeing a decent channel. So there's three main sources of artifact that we can see. Physiological, meaning it's coming from the patient. That could be anything from they're moving, them sweating, you're seeing their pulse beat in areas other than the EKG, chewing, anything like that. Environmental is an artifact that's coming from the electrical field surrounding the equipment. That could be their cell phone, that could be something they have plugged in near the equipment if they're on a computer. I can tell you anytime I've ever had a patient try to sleep with a heating pad, one of the plug-in heating pads, I've had to ask them to turn it off because it just causes so much electrical interference. Mechanical artifact is any artifact that's coming from some component of the recording equipment, meaning that it is either a bad wire or something's off, it's not plugged in correctly, something like that. But it's our responsibility to not only identify the artifacts that we're seeing, find them, identify them, and correct them. So there are some instances, though, where it's not always frugal to go in and correct an artifact. So, for instance, if a patient's asleep, sometimes the better response is to actually wait it out and let them wake on their own. If they wake up to go to the restroom or something, then you fix whatever needs to be fixed, because you've really got to weigh the importance of, is it worth waking the patient up versus the potential detriment that could have on the patient's sleep and on their study to the signal that you're trying to correct. That being said, you still have to document everything. I mean, if you haven't, one of my big things, if you haven't picked it up by now, is documentation. If you don't document it, it didn't happen. So even in the instances where you're choosing to not correct an artifact, it still needs to be documented that you see the artifact, you can tell what's causing it, and you're choosing not to correct it because of whatever reason. Patient's asleep, utilizing an alternative channel, something like that. If you don't just heading back to that one, if you don't document that you see the artifact and that you're choosing to not fix it, what'll happen and how it'll be interpreted by anybody else reviewing this study is it comes across as if you didn't see the artifact at all, that it was an incompetence, or you just didn't even recognize it. You don't know enough about what you're doing to even see that that artifact was happening. So even when you choose to not fix it, you still have to document that you see it and you're choosing not to fix it. So some examples of physiological artifacts that are originating from the patient. We could have EKG artifacts, meaning you're going to see the EKG channel or the EKG kind of heartbeat in a channel other than the EKG. As you've continued and started to practice staging, you can see movement. Even like the slightest movement can cause a huge variation in a person's signals. When a person sweats, that's called also known as sway or slow wave artifact. That can really obscure what we're looking at. Sometimes you can have snoring artifact, and there's so many more than I have listed here. This is just more of an introduction to the different artifacts. So we could have chewing or swallowing if they're eating, muscle artifact. There's so many. But let's cover some of the bigger ones today. EKG artifact is when you have contamination from your heart or your EKG channel in any of the other channels other than your EKG. And how we know that it's EKG artifact is if you look at all these crazy spikes going on in your EEGs and your EOGs. We know it's EKG because these spikes line directly up with the spikes of the EKG channel. That's how we know that it's not actually these spikes are coming from the patient's brainwave activity. It's not that they're, potentially having a seizure causing these very abnormal, very sharp looking spikes, but rather it lines up with their EKG. That's just contamination from their EKG, from their heart. It's very common to see this artifact in patients that have hypertension. Typically, when somebody does have high blood pressure, the heart rate can be more easily felt in areas of the body away from the heart. So there's certain patients that there's just no getting around it. You're going to see this artifact. But most often, the primary cause of what's causing this EKG contamination is poor electrode placement. And so it's not actually the EKG leads that you need to move. Let's look back here. So oftentimes we think it's EKG artifact. Let's move our EKG channels. That's not the correct answer. So what you've got to look at is in your EEG and EOG channels, the two common electrodes that everything is referenced to. That's your M1, M2. When you have EKG artifact in these channels, your eyes and your EEG, it's usually because of poor electrode placement of your M1 and M2. If you don't go high enough behind the ear on that bone, and you're more on a softer area behind the ear, you can cause that kind of pulse beat to be felt and to be picked up by the M's. And so the correct way to try to fix this would be to actually go in and try to move where the location of your M's are. Move them up a little bit higher. Make sure they're really on the most pointiest and hardest part of the bone that you can really get the M's on. Another option, so say for instance, we don't have the ability to move any of the electrodes off the affected pulse. What we can do is we can re-reference, which means to try to avoid the affected electrode. That's what re-referencing is. So say for instance the EKG artifact was worse in the M1, then what we could do is all of these leads that are referenced to M1 would be to reference them to M2 instead. So we're just avoiding the electrode that's worse off. When you have EKG artifact in a muscle channel, that always means poor electrode placement. Always. So depending on where you're seeing the EKG artifact is really going to focus on what's causing it and how you're going to fix it. When you see it in your eyes and your EEG channels, the hope would be to go in and try to move those M's, but if you can't, or say the patient has high blood pressure, your placement is spot on, in all likelihood you're going to get EKG artifact regardless just because of the patient, then we can talk about kind of the digital ways of correcting them. But when you have EKG artifact in a muscle channel, that would be your chin or your legs, that's always because of poor electrode placement. There's no way to digitally correct it. You need to go in and fix your electrode placements. And that's why it's so important to be so precise with where you're applying those electrodes, because with the muscle channels, what you've got to figure is you're applying at least 2 electrodes per each muscle. 2 electrodes on the left leg, 2 on the right leg, 3 on the chin. But in how you get a channel for each of these muscles, for the chin and for the left leg, the right leg, is 2 of the electrodes, they ping off of each other. So left leg 1 pings off of left leg 2 in order to create this signal. Same thing with your EMG. One of the EMG 1 pings off of EMG 2 to create this signal. EMG 3 is the backup. So when you distance your electrodes too far apart, remember the recommended distance is 2 centimeters to distance between your EMG electrodes and also your legs. So when you start to deviate from the recommended standard setup, what happens is you get an increased distance between your electrodes, and then they have to travel through that much more body matter in order to ping off of each other. So you're a lot more likely to pick up these kind of EKG contamination. So EKG artifact in your EMG channels is always indicative of poor electrode placement. Digitally, though, if we have EKG artifact in your EEG or I channels, your EOG channels, what we can do is try to digitally correct it, and that would be through re-referencing. So either if it's one of the electrodes that are impacted, try to re-reference and avoid it. Digitally we can kind of change how the montage is configured. The other way we can correct this is through double referencing. So double referencing utilizes a component where we haven't covered this yet. We'll talk about it in electrical theory, but like signals cancel each other out. So to kind of give a little bit of background on that, M1 and M2 are placed on the bone behind the ear, the mastoid bone. That's why they're called M1 and M2. It's a very kind of dull area. It's not gonna, because of the thickness of that bone, it's not gonna pick up any kind of biopotentials from the patient. It's not like it's gonna pick up potential brain waves underneath there or anything like that. And so the reason why we apply these reference electrodes is they're picking up all the ambient electrical activity in the patient's room as all the other electrodes that we apply. So you have these active electrodes, or what's known as exploring electrodes, that you apply that we want to pick up these signals. Your C3, C4, O1, O2, F3, F4, they're placed over an area of the brain that we want to record the brainwave activity. Not only are those electrodes recording the brainwave activity, but they're also recording all of the ambient electrical activity going on in the room. And the M1 and M2 are not picking up any brainwave activity, but what they are picking up is all the ambient electrical activity in the room. And so that's why when you look at the way the montage or our configuration of channels is put together, all of the active electrodes, your C's, your F's, your O's, are all referenced to one of the M's, because it uses the input from both of those electrodes to be able to figure out what ultimately gets displayed on the computer screen, on the polysomnograph. And so the process of this is called common mode rejection, which essentially is like signals cancel each other out. So we'll do like the C3, M2. You have C3 and it's placed in the area over the brain that we want to record this electrical activity. Your M is recording the ambient electrical activity in the room. They both come together, and the like signals that come through get cleaned out or washed out, because the like signals coming through between those two electrodes, when you compare them, is all the ambient electrical activity that we don't want to record. And so that's kind of the process of common mode rejection. So double referencing, what we do is we tie digitally M1 and M2 together. We kind of average the input from both of those electrodes into the system, with the thought being that common mode rejection is going to cancel out the like signal coming through, which is that EKG artifact. We can do it digitally, where we go in and we change the montage and change, instead of having, all the electrodes, and I'm going to skip back here so you can see like all these electrodes, like left eye to M2, right eye to M1, you would see left eye to the average of M1, M2, right eye to the average of M1 and M2. They're averaged together. And then that will really clear up a lot of the EKG artifact. There's other systems, though, that have to use what's called a jumper cable, and it's kind of an older way of doing it, but it's interesting. We still use them, where you physically tie M1 and M2 together. It's this little kind of jumper cable you plug into M1, M2, and then there's a cable between it, and it physically ties the two together, so that way it can, it combines the signal coming through from M1 and M2. So re-referencing will come up again, the kind of thought behind when we would re-reference. You can re-reference for other various types of issues as well, such as like, say, one of your left legs popped off, like left leg 2. You can certainly re-reference left leg 1 to one of your right legs to kind of continue to get a channel until you're able to go in and fix it instead of waking the patient up. So re-referencing will come back a few times for other types of troubleshooting. Double referencing, though, is only beneficial to reduce EKG artifact in your EEG or EOG channels. The only time you will ever double reference is to reduce EKG artifact in your EEG or EOG channels. Let me say it for a third time because it's important. Double referencing is only used to reduce EEG artifact in your Double referencing is only used to reduce EKG artifact in your EEGs and EOGs. That's it. If you have EKG artifact in your muscles, you got to go in and fix them. You got to move the electrodes so that you make sure that they're close together, close enough. That's the only time you'll ever double reference. It doesn't help with any other type of artifact, nothing else. Just EKG in your EEGs and EOG channels. All right. Hopefully you wrote that one down because I feel like I just said it 4 to 5 times, so probably important. Movement artifact. So movement artifact, you guys have seen it as you've practiced staging. When somebody moves, it pretty much, you get this craziness happening and it can obscure everything that you're seeing. It's not like we're going to do anything about it because it goes away on its own. As soon as a patient stops moving, the signals will settle out. In some instances, if you have a patient that's like moving excessively or something like that, you can ask them to try to calm down or relax or, maybe not move that way. But generally, it's just one of those things that you'll see it come across where the patient's moving around and you just got to wait for everything to settle, and eventually it will. Sway artifact. Sway artifact, also referred to as slow wave artifact or sweat artifact. Essentially, it's a slow frequency. That's why it's called slow wave artifact. It's coming through as a very kind of slow rolling waveform and kind of bounce within your electrodes. And it's caused by sweat. So when any of our patients sweat, it creates this kind of salt bridge between the electrode and the connection that it has to the scalp, and it causes these very slow kind of bouncing, rolling artifact in your channels. Very common. It usually affects your eye channels and your EEGs. You can see it also affect your EKGs, your chins. I mean, some people really sweat, so you can pretty much see it throughout. But the main place where you'll see it is in your eyes, in your EEG. How we can fix it, you want to correct the problem. So try to cool the patient off, lower the thermostat, turn a fan on. If they are sleeping with a bunch of blankets, go in and take a blanket off. Do what you can to try to cool them down. And you'll notice too that oftentimes the labs try to keep the temperature pretty cool so that, to try to avoid this, because most people do sweat at night while they're sleeping. So to try to kind of circumvent this sweat artifact, we try to keep it cool. You'll see in your textbook, it does say that you can take the electrode off, dry the area, reapply it. I can say I've never seen this done in any professional circumstance. I'm not going to go in and wake the patient up, dry off each individual electrode spot, and then reapply it. Only time this has ever happened is like summertime. Patient comes in, they are sweating heavy, and they are just, as soon as you put the electrodes on, they just melt right off. So some techs even keep a little bit of antiperspirant in their locker to put on the patient's scalp to stop them from sweating so they can get their electrodes placed. How we know that it's sweat artifact is because it's not really correlating to anything else. So as you become more familiar with staging and what appears to be normal, you'll become more familiar with what's abnormal. And so I'm going to jump back to the slide with the slow wave artifact. You'll see that these aren't in sync with each other. Like your O's, these top channels here are just completely out of sync and not bouncing in time with the other ones. They're all kind of doing their own thing, but you're seeing this kind of bounce and sway to it. And it can make reading the brainwaves very difficult because sometimes it can even cause it to like flatten line out because it's just so bad. And you kind of have to kind of read what's going on the bounce, like read through the bounce to see what's happening. So it can really make things difficult to read. The other problem too is sometimes it can be misinterpreted as the patient's true brainwaves. Like, oh, you see this slow bouncing in the waveform, and you might think that it is EEG slow waves and misstage it as them being in stage 3, when in fact they aren't. They're sweating a lot. So the other solution that we can do is we can increase the low frequency filter. The low frequency filter is a filter that's applied that will block any of the lower or slower frequencies from coming through. By raising it temporarily, slightly, you can block the kind of this slow wave bounce coming through. And I say temporarily raise it because you don't want to increase it for the rest of the study. Typically, patients, they might sweat a little bit and then their body self-regulates and you're fine. Especially if you have a female that is having a hot flash, it'll go away. You just gotta wait it out. And I never play with my filters on my eye channels because when you start increasing or playing around with filters on your eyes, it can filter out the slow rolling eye movements that you might see. So I kind of just deal with the sweat artifact in the eyes, and if I absolutely need to, I'll raise the low frequency filter for the EEGs, but beyond that, it's always temporary, and you always have to document that you did everything else too. You've tried lowering the thermostat, or you already did the thermostats as low as it can be, fans on, something like that you've tried other measures before trying to just digitally do that. Snore artifact. Snore artifact can be caused by snoring. Usually appears as this high amplitude kind of burst of snore activity, and you typically will see it in your chin channel. So here's a snore and you've got the chin and you see the increase in the chin. Sometimes it's an artifact, or sometimes the patient's just snoring that severely that it's almost causing this like rattle in their chin that you see it come through in the EMG channel, and it pretty much lines right up with each snore. This is one of those artifacts that you document. It's not one of those things that you're going to be able to fix, because as soon as the patient stops snoring, the artifact goes away. And it's one of those things you document that you've seen it. Environmental artifacts. These are artifacts that originate from sources other than the patient, typically from their immediate environment. So it usually comes through in the 60 hertz range, because all of our wall outlets and electrical devices in the United States operate on 60 hertz. So that's where you'll see it come through, and it's also called 60 hertz artifact because that's what it is. It's the frequency of the artifact coming through. And there's a few other versions of these artifacts that you might see, of electrode popping or blocking. So electrical noise is when, if you might have an electrode that's broken or it's disconnected, it starts to pick up the electrical activity from other sources other than what we want to see it. And so it'll come through in the frequency range of 60 hertz. And it's very fast. 60 hertz is very fast, especially when you think of what the frequencies of our typical brain waves are. So theta, delta, beta, alpha. Our brain waves typically come through anywhere from as low as 2 hertz to as high as 15 hertz. So to have this 60 hertz artifact coming through, it comes through as the very fast activity. You can't even see the up-down nature of the artifact. And instead, what it ends up doing is it just kind of makes it a thicker appearance. That's what it comes through and looks, because you can't see the up-down nature. It's just so fast, so it just comes through as making it blurry or bolder, and it kind of makes it stand out from the rest. This artifact can occur in any of the channels that operate off of alternating current. So that would be your EEGs, your EOGs, EKGs, essentially everything except for your respiratory channels, so your flow, your belts, and your your SpO2. So any of the other channels, EEG, EOG, snore, EKG, legs, am I missing one? They are all open to potentially having 60 hertz artifact. The most common cause of 60 hertz artifact is high and unequal electrode impedances. So you guys are pretty familiar with the need for having decent and low impedance levels. But one thing we really haven't talked about is having equal impedance levels. Having your electrode impedances being fairly equal is just as important as having them low. So if you have a patient that, you can't scrub their skin anymore, either because of their hair or their skin or something, you're just not able to get your impedances down to where you want to see them, then at the very least, just make sure they're all even. Because that'll allow that common mode rejection to take place, where for the amplifier and the digital end of things to really do what it needs to do. And we'll cover that in electrical theory. But high and unequal electrode impedance levels are the most common cause. And look, I even bolded it out for you. So should I say it one more time, or do you understand that it's important? I'm going to say it one more time. High and unequal electrode impedances are the most common cause of 60 hertz artifact. And so you can get these high impedances when the application is poor, the electrode isn't secure against the skin or the scalp, so either it's not pushed down all the way or it started to fall off, something like that. Maybe you didn't use enough paste to really electrically insulate and get the electrode on. If the electrode site wasn't properly cleaned, or if the wire was broken, obviously, that'll cause a lot of artifact, or if it was dirty. So, sorry. So having a dirty sensor can be just as an issue. You guys, when you're in the lab and practicing and you've already re-scrubbed the electrode site, you feel like you've done a pretty good job of it, next step would be to try re-scrubbing the actual electrode itself, because if they weren't cleaned properly, if they weren't all scrubbed out with and physically scrubbed with the toothbrush, they can come through and cause some poor signals. So some other issues you might find is if there's a faulty or broken electrode. Sometimes you don't even realize the electrode is broken until you start taking it off, and then it's all of a sudden as you're taking off the patient, you see the cold cup disconnects from the wire. If you have a loose cable connection, so if the electrode doesn't fit securely in the head box, if the head box isn't, maybe the cable to the head box has become loose, basically when there's a opening anywhere, it almost acts like an antenna that it's going to pick up any electrical activity happening in the room, and you're going to get a ton of 60 hertz artifact in. And that goes for not only just a broken equipment or a poor cable connection, but if you don't have the electrode securely in place and it's kind of hanging out there a little bit loose, it's going to act like an antenna, and it's going to try to pick up anything that it can, any electrical activity that it can. The other thing you got to look at is, what is the patient doing? What electrical device are they on, or is near them, in their pocket, whatever. I always ask patients to not plug their phones in the same set of outlets that we have our equipment plugged in, because it can and does cause a lot of artifact. Pay attention to that. Oftentimes, when you guys are in the lab practicing and I'm looking, say I'm helping, if you're the one to set up, it's very common to just sit there on your phone, but oftentimes I can see when a message is coming in, because I can see that kind of electrical interference coming through whenever, and then I'll hear your phone go off that you got a message, and I can see it on the signals on the polysomnograph, which is really interesting. But all of our electrical devices, they can and do impact what we're trying to record. So pay attention to that. Look at your patient and what they have and what they're doing before you go in and run in and just scrub their skin till it's raw. Do what you can to try to save their skin. So when you do have 60 hertz artifact, because the number one cause of it is high and unequal impedances, you typically, because of poor electrode application, you do want to try to fix the one that was poor. Ideally, we want all electrode impedances to be under 5 kilo ohms. And, just troubleshoot. Make sure, remove any electrical devices near from the patient. Take their phone away. I really love this for patients that will sit on their phone at night and not fall asleep. I'll go in there and say, okay, I've got to take your phone away because it's causing a lot of electrical interference. And it might not always. Sometimes I'll just pull that line if they're just on their phone and not going to bed, and I want to see them try to go to bed and, make use of their time in the sleep lab. So common mode rejection is that principle that I already touched on a little bit earlier, but it's essentially where like signals eliminate itself. And you'll typically see this 60 hertz artifact in your leg channels, because they act as antenna. The longer the leads are, the more likelihood they can pick up some ambient electrical activity. So very common to see it in your leg channels. So whenever possible, avoid extension cords. We try to keep our cables as short as possible, but obviously we need to give the patient room to move. And whenever possible, make sure your impedances are low and equal. Oh, there it is again, and I think that's the 7th time I've said it. So if you haven't taken a note at this point, you might want to take that note. Digitally, we can correct 60 hertz artifact through built-in filters, and that's called a 60 hertz filter or a notch filter, sometimes called a line filter, but essentially it attenuates signals coming through in the 59 to 61 hertz range, and that will reduce all the ambient electrical activity coming through at 60 hertz, because no physiologic signal like EEG, EOG is going to come through at 60 hertz. That's always going to be electrical interference. So this filter will correct it, but you really want to use it as a last resort. It's not, you don't want to be in the habit of applying all these filters, making your signals look pretty, and then have poor kind of integrity of your channels to begin with. The purpose is to have a quality hookup. And you can use the notch filter as a last resort. Maybe you have a patient that has very sensitive skin. You weren't able to scrub as as much as you normally would, or something like that. They really should be your absolute last resort. You want to try to fix the problem at its source instead of kind of putting a band-aid on it with a filter. So notch filters are not to be used routinely in your recordings. They can camouflage a bad signal and ultimately lead to a bad study if you are in the habit of just applying all your filters, making it look pretty without actually having quality signals come through. Um, and that doesn't bode well for you as a tech, in your reputation that you're trying to build. You want to make sure that you are doing what you can to get as good of signals as possible. Electrode popping is another form of 60 hertz artifact, and it comes through, instead of having constant 60 hertz artifact coming through, it comes through as a kind of an occasional pop or burst of activity, usually caused by a loose connection or a broken wire. I typically have seen it in the lab and on overnights, because of the drying of the electrode stickers, those EKG snap stickers, if they start to dry out, or if there's tension on the wire. I typically see that if the patient, moved around a lot and those leg leads ended up getting a little bit tight underneath their pajamas. Every time they breathe in and their belly expands, it kind of pulls on those wires a little bit, and you can start to see the popping there. You can see it with all the other causes of 60 hertz artifact: a dirty electrode, poor application, electrical interference, but it's typically because of a drying of the wire or a tension on the wire. Not generally worth going in to fix it, because if you look, it's usually just this like brief burst of 60 hertz artifact. I can still see my channels. I can still read the leg leads clearly, the legs channels clearly. It's not interfering with what I'm looking at, but if it is, then you need to go in and fix it. You need to either, pull the leg leads down a little bit, give them a little more slack so they're not, pulling on the sticker, the snap sticker connection to the skin. If necessary, replace the snap sticker if you feel like it might have dried out. Try to eliminate any electrical interference. But again, you have to weigh the importance of, is it worth waking the patient up with the potential detriment to the study. And for the most part, when I see electrode popping, it's not worth waking the patient up for. It's worth checking on if they wake up on their own, but not waking them up just for that, unless if it's to the point that it's happening so much that you cannot read your signals underneath it. Pen blocking is a form of artifact that can happen when you start to see this kind of I'm going to show you as I explain it. You start to see the waveform block off or square off. And so essentially what that means is the channel properties, say these channels properties aren't set appropriately so that you can fully see these channels deflect within the parameters of the computer system. And so that usually is because of an improper kind of amplitude setting on these channels. Another way to say amplitude is gain. Gain is how we are able to adjust the height of the, whenever you hear gain, it refers directly to the height of the channels. So what you need to do is adjust the amplitude, adjust the height, or decrease the gain so that you can fully see the channels deflect within their channel properties. This, however, when you see pen blocking typically in your EEG channels or your EOG channels, that's usually because of sweat. When sweat kind of gets so bad, it starts to cause pen blocking. So instead of playing around with the amplitude of those channels, you would want to go in and fix what's causing the pen blocking, which would be cool the patient off. When you see pen blocking in the respiratory channels, that's an instance of needing to go in and actually change and play around with the height of the channels. And let me see if I can find an example of pen blocking in respiratory. Hold on. All right, so here's an example of pen blocking in your respiratory channels. So you see on the chest and the abdomen where it blocks or squares off, that you're not able to fully see the depth of that breath, because each of these waveforms represent their patient's tidal volume, how deep of a breath they're taking. And so when you see it block off, it means they took a deep enough breath that we don't have these channel properties set appropriately to really see the full nature of their breath. And so we would need to decrease the gain or decrease the height or decrease, the amplitude of those waveforms. Here's another example of it. So you have the abdomen belt looks fine. The chest belt, you have this squaring appearance. So you would want to adjust the height of the waveform in that one. So gain and sensitivity are two terms used interchangeably to describe the height of the channel. And that's something we'll talk about more again with the electrical theory, but gain means the amplification of a channel. So the higher the gain, the higher the waveform height. And basically the premise behind these terms is that the biological potentials that we are recording from our patients are so minute in comparison to all the other potentials and electrical activity going on in the world, in the field, in the room around them. And so we do need to amplify these signals in order to see them on our computer screen. And so they are oftentimes amplified. So, and that's referred to as their gain. So it's how many times the waveform signals are amplified. So the higher the gain, the higher the waveform height. Sensitivity has an inverse relationship to our waveform height. So the higher the sensitivity, the lower the waveform height. So if we had a squaring off on a channel, we would want to either decrease the gain or increase the sensitivity in order to lower the waveform height to be able to fully see the channels deflect. I feel like I just said that, so I'm skipping ahead. So another issue is if you do have filter settings that aren't set appropriately for each channel. As you continue to practice and work, have your mini Sprigs textbook with you. It's really helpful, and it's got a page where it's just got a chart of all the typical filter settings that each channel should have in order for you to best see the channel that you want to see. And so for the most part, once the filters are set, you shouldn't need to play around with them. And you kind of want to just leave them alone, because if you play around with filters to just make it look pretty the way you think it should look, you can really impact the integrity of the recording, especially if you're playing around with filters and you don't have a quality of recording to begin with, but you play around with your filters to make it to the point that it just looks nice. By not filtering a channel, it shouldn't really have an impact on the signals that are coming through, because as long as you did a quality hookup to begin with, your signals will be pretty clean to begin with. Filters are there if we need them, but they really are more of a last resort. So you need to be able to start to work on identifying artifacts and working on how to eliminate them. Whenever possible, we don't want to use filters, because again, you're just kind of putting a band-aid on just a sloppy signal. So instead of trying to make it look pretty, get it looking pretty by doing a quality hookup. I can't stress this enough on how important the quality and integrity of our electrode application is and how much it directly relates to the quality and integrity of the sleep study recording. If you don't apply the electrodes well, if you don't have them in the place where they should be, there's instances where they sometimes have had to repeat sleep studies because they're just, well, this isn't a good test, this isn't a good study, this is, this isn't good. And it's your job to get a good study. So that's why it's so important on applying the electrodes accurately and applying them well, that they're going to stay on the patient throughout the night, that you're going to get a good signal from them. Filters, you need to be able to identify and correct the artifacts. Ideally, filters are there so that way, we can use them if we need them, especially if the situation calls for not waking a patient up, trying to let them sleep as much as possible. But for the most part, you really want to make sure that, the filters only enhance the data that you're recording and they're not just making it look pretty. You're not gussying up a toad. So you want to have good signals coming through to start. Whenever troubleshooting, whenever you do have issues, and again, as you continue to practice, as you get the opportunities to practice in the lab, the more you do it, the more proficient you'll become at it. Once you've been through a situation of having to troubleshoot this or that, it's something that you can add to your experience, to your memory bank, and then you'll know how to do it when it happens the next time, if it happens the next time. It's so much more valuable you going through it and doing it than me sitting here and telling you, okay, this is what you need to do. This is what this is what you need to do. Once you've seen it for yourself and had to fix it, that's when you really start to understand and grasp the artifacts. So whenever possible, when you do need to fix something, it's always good to kind of have this system in place to help to kind of be a little more focused with how you're going to fix things. So one way that I do it is I usually start at the patient and then I work back. Make sure the electrode's on, make sure it's applied well. If necessary, re-scrub it, re-clean the wire, reapply it, make sure there's enough paste, follow it back. Is it plugged in correctly? Is the head box plugged in? Is the cable connecting the head box to the amplifier, is that connection secure? What is your patient doing? Are they restless? Are they sweating? Are they moving? Are they on their phone? What electrical devices are near them? The impedance bit you guys get. You get impedances are important. The whole point of this is the impedances are the not the whole story. It's important to start actually looking at your signals and figuring out what you need to fix based on the signals and not just the impedances. Are the electrodes plugged in correctly? Is everything secure? Is the cables connected? Because sometimes they become loose. Did you turn the computer on, choose the right type of study that you needed? And sometimes, for whatever reason, when we go into the systems, the filters might reset and all go to zero, and you have to go in and turn them back on. So are the filters set appropriately? Does the machine calibrate? We want to calibrate everything. So this is just one of those instances of where I really want to stress the importance of the impedances. They don't tell the whole story. You're not going to, you really need to start looking at your signals. And a prime example of this would be like with EKG artifact. This setup here is very clean. All the channels are coming through very well. And so you can see that the impedances are would in all likelihood be fantastic. But what you won't see from the impedance levels is this type of artifact coming through. So impedance levels are important, but they're not everything. We've got to use all the tools in our arsenal to try to make sure that we are looking at our electrodes, becoming familiar with what our signals should look like, so we know when they don't look like that, okay, there's something that needs to be fixed.